They told it as a caution in kitchens where the kettle steamed and the window panes wept, that the Hartwell house had a pulse that outlasted its line, and that the beat was not of flesh but of the walls, steady as a pump that would not learn silence. The first time I stood in the south parlor, the light falling thin through gauze curtains the color of old bone, I felt it underfoot, a gentle percussion pressed through the joists in a way that found the cartilage between the ribs and taught it a lesson. Dust lifted when the beat came, a little, as if dancing to a hymn that had not been written to please God, and the green paper on the walls, once a proud damask brought from Paris in warmer years, had crusted to a bloom that flaked at a whisper. There was a smell of fine sugar turned to poison, a bitter sweetness like pennyroyal and penny coins held too long, and under it the iron note of a cistern that had stood full in the dark for a lifetime. In a drawer lined with blue velvet, I found 5 ivory-colored wristlets wrapped in tissue, not restraints by design, but cuffs meant to keep kid gloves from slumping. Yet each bore in a clerk's hand the name of a wife who had begun here with bouquets and ended under locks that did not yield to vows. Hair combs lay with those cuffs, beaded with powder as if the air had been busy at work while no one watched, and when I pressed a tooth of one comb to paper, it left a light green stripe that shamed the paper like a bruise. A clock on the mantel, that had not run in 20 years, offered an occasional click as if to argue with the beat under the floor, and somewhere in the wall, a pipe sighed in the confident tone of a man who believes his house is reasonable even when his conduct suggests otherwise. The ledger the solicitor gave me said that the Hartwell title had passed out of the blood with the death of the last son in a sanitarium upstate, which is another way of saying that whatever haunted the place had been thorough and patient, and that I had been engaged to take inventory of a life spent on fashioning a respectable ruin. When I crossed to the door to fetch more light, the gas bracket on the wall, long since capped, breathed a weak chill into my wrist, as if the valve remembered the thumb that had turned it night after night, and I felt a kind of foolishness take me, the kind that has a smell and a season, and I stood very still until the breath passed. The town called it Concord's North Edge, though it lay farther toward the river's bend and the cotton works than a map would like, a broad federal with a Greek front added in the years when ambition went in for columns that promised a republic's manners even in the bedrooms. The first Hartwell to cut stone here, Silas, had made his name on a run of cheap cloth that caught the Army's eye in '61, and what he had not learned in his father's counting room, he learned from 3 winters in Lowell Mills, where girls, lungs taught him that labor could be had at a price the ledgers would smile upon. He put his money into a reservoir above the house and the mill, a concern engineered by a neighbor who had a way with numbers and water, and men said you could tell the Hartwell hour by the thunder of his gates. Inside, the rooms were generous in the way of families that draw their chairs close to the fire, only to keep their distance in words, and the parlor was papered in that famous green that the magazines swore a duchess had admired in Paris, which meant that Mrs. Hartwell was a duchess by proxy within the square mile where such things mattered. Gas came in with the second wife, Eliza, because she liked new things and had grown up in a house where lamps had been replaced by a hiss in the wall, and the pipes hid themselves handsomely in the baseboards and mantels so that light could be had with a turn and a match and no smell of whale. The cistern stood beneath the kitchen, lined in lead against the sullen water that would insist on finding its way through mortar, given enough years. And the scullery girl learned to love the sound of the pump because it told her when the house wanted attention. She said later it sounded like a patient creature making the best of a task. The grounds fell away toward the river and the mills, and at night the house heard the looms like a far rain, which is the sweetest sound a machine can make when it means to take what it needs. There were proper people in the house. A nurse who had learned her trade at McLean when ladies with inconvenient nerves were placed gently and praised for their progress. A cook who had a way with white sauce that impressed the minister. A man of all work, who moved through the rooms like a footnote marking the places where the parlor and pantry pretended not to touch. It would have looked sane to any stranger with a watch and a prayer, and perhaps it was at first, which is how sane things begin their mischief. I came to the Hartwell place in the fall of '49 under a letter with a seal from a Boston firm that had handled their affairs in a manner discreet enough to leave appetites intact. My task was to sort, to list, to value, and to mind any paper that wanted to run out the door with the weather. The last of them had died that spring after a short stay at a rest house that took fine silver crests and charged by the week without, asking ladies to attend supper, and the Boston man wanted the old house emptied with as little talk as possible, which is to say that he anticipated just enough talk to keep his client's weather from turning. I had lived with ledgers long enough to know the tone of a fine family's accounts when nerves had dictated large decisions and a doctor's clean hand had set a seal upon that doctrine, and I had learned the names of hospitals that did Christian work by locking a door and the names of physicians who called a woman's grief a diagnosis. Butler in Providence had a reputation for kindness and a lawn with trees that acted as if the wind were a gentleman, whereas Danvers had a stern back and a facade that taught obedience by architecture. The Hartwells had spent money at both, and the ledgers recorded those disbursements in the same ink as the feed for carriage horses and the delivery of cut ice. The house itself held a climate of its own, cold in a way that did not yield even when the sun made a little progress at the west windows, and the floorboards were softer than their varnish suggested, as if the beat had shaken the fibers loose and taught them the lesson of water. On the second day, a tinsmith came to take the measure of the brass knobs and grates, and he muttered, as men do when they mean to say something without owning it, that the gas pipes had been fiddled with in a way he did not admire. He shrugged and went back to counting, and I made a note that he would not be called when delicate matters arose. On a high shelf in the library, I found a row of boxes that had been labeled in a woman's hand, precise when her health permitted such things, and each bore a name and a year. When I pulled the first down, the dust behaved as dust always does and revealed itself as an accusation. Each box held the fragments of a life: hair wrapped in ribbon, little prescriptions in brown glass, a glove with a stain of green at the wrist where the cuff had kissed it, a hymn book with a page folded to the same verse by different fingers, and underneath was a paper with an admission date and the name of the physician who had made the recommendation. 5 boxes for 5 wives, and under each a quiet of the sort that screams in its way of not wanting to be understood. The names read like a genealogy of patients transformed into ciphers. The first wife was called Margaret when she took the oath by the hearth and called it Madge, in letters to a sister 2 counties distant who had never seen the house and had an imagination that did not need a map. Her years were from 58 to 64, and she went to bed with the smell of powder and dye in her hair on a summer night, and rose with a fever for the river that her husband called a craving, and the doctor named a condition. She was the daughter of a merchant, whose receipts were held with kindness by Silas, when the war threw everything into a pan and heated it until it bled, and he made certain that the merchant's debt was extinguished the day Margaret's father gave her hand, which is a romantic way of saying he knew the ledger's arithmetic from both sides. In the second year of her marriage, she complained of a headache that would not leave. She wrote that the parlor made her dizzy as if the walls were steep and the chairs were on a slope, and that the lamps trembled when she had asked no one to light them, and that the paper left powder on her fingers when she traced the damask's vine to occupy herself under the windows. She conceived in '62 and delivered before the fall, a little boy who held on like a bird on a wire, weak but certain, and she had a month's peace of a sort before something in her sleep grew teeth. She began to speak all night without knowing. Words the nurse wrote down in a book because the physician had instructed her that lists of nonsense might someday be made sensible by a man's attention. There are receipts for laudanum and bath salts and a visit from a Providence doctor who did not mind traveling when the weather suited his horse. And then there is a longer page with a neat line of text that sums a life. Admitted for neurasthenia. Rest recommended, husband to pay in advance. Margaret's sister kept her letters and gave them to me when I went to see her as an old woman who had grown fierce with time. In one letter, Margaret describes peeling back a corner of paper to see what lay under the green, and finding plaster wet enough to hold her nail and crystals like frost that stung her when she breathed upon them. The house took her in the 4th year and did not spit her back whole. She died at Danvers in 64 of a fever that was called by the name influenza, and by others gas, and the infant followed not long after, which is the way of such stories. And the ledger is quiet for a space, as if paper has a respect that men cannot muster. Eliza came from a family with long hair and opinions about lamps, and her confidence carried her over the threshold in 67 with a dress too new for the house, as if a young woman could improve a place by the mere insistence of her hem when it swept the stair. She liked the sound of gas and refused to bear tallow smoke upon her curtains, and she pressed her husband into installing new jets in the sitting rooms and a mantle in the dining room that made the glass bleed a little light into the ceiling and pleased her friends. In the first winter, she took bronchial complaints, and the physician told her to stay indoors, and she did so in the green parlor that she said looked well by both day and evening, and she began to feel the thrum of the house in her knees when she sat too long and in the bones of her neck when she tried to close her eyes after the lamps had been darkened. Eliza considered herself modern. She read the magazines, and in one magazine a man wrote that the presence of arsenic in certain papers had excited comment in Paris drawing rooms, but was considered an old woman's tale among men of sense. She laughed at the notion and told the nurse to have the maids dust more. She conceived in 68 and delivered a daughter with a good head of hair and a cry like a penny whistle. And in the weeks afterward, she developed a suspicion of everyone's motives that the doctor called the moral effect of confinement, and the husband said must be eased by travel. They took her in the carriage over to the sea for a week, and she returned calmer in the ways that matter to husbands, and worse in the ways that matter to a woman who wishes to keep her mind. The lamps worried her. The nurse wrote that Eliza woke, with her heart racing when the jets flickered, and the cook found her once in the night in the pantry with her hand upon the gas tap, turning it as if to argue with invisible company in the walls. In the second spring, Eliza made a habit of stealing down to the kitchen to lay her ear to the floor where the pump made its beat, and she said that it comforted her and that it was the only sound that never lied. A week later, she demanded the valves be turned and the curtains drawn, and the doctor wrote that her condition would be improved by simple diet and seclusion from family. She refused Danvers and wrote to a cousin who had married into a family that knew the men at McLean, and she went there under a carful of camphor-scented shawls, and her husband wrote a letter to the editor about the dangers of the modern novel for women of impressionable temper, and the house beat on. Honora was Irish by way of Lowell and came with a promise from Silas to her mother that she would be treated like a lady and not set to work beyond her strength. She had hair so black it seemed blue where the window struck it, and a laugh that had a sound of iron in it from the mills, and a spine that knew how to hold up a room without showing the effort. She married Ambrose, Silas's son, because time never rests. And she moved into a house that was now wearing 2 generations' worth of dust under its stairs, and behaved as if it had learned something from each. By then, the water gas plant stood in the carriage house, a contraption that made its own evening out of coke and water and a little cleverness, and the boys who kept it alive on cold nights said that the wind loved it like a dog and licked at its louvers. Honora liked the pump's sound too, because in a life of mills and men's opinions, a steady beat that does not ask is something like kindness, but the beat seemed to speak sometimes in a tone that put a thought in her that she could not shake. And she wrote this down in the back of a cookbook where a man would not think to look. She took to sleeping in the blue room because the green of the parlor had begun to put a taste of medicine in her mouth even when she closed the door, and she wrote to a cousin that the blue soothed her, and the windows there looked to the north, where the river was honest and the mills too far to hear. Honora conceived twice, and twice the belly ended in blood in the 5th month, and afterward she sat very still and watched the jets when they hissed, and her hand knew the turn of the valve better than her own name when she woke in the night, with the sense that the room had changed, as if a visitor had entered by a passage no one had told her about. There are notes in Ambrose's hand that speak of noise carried in pipe and vent to the blue room, and an improvement in a wife's disposition. When the house is kept to its rights, which reads like a remark about meat and is in fact a remark about a woman. Honora rose one morning and went to the parlor and tore the corner of the paper with her nail and put the bits of green in a tin box and hid the box in the hollow under the stair where children had once kept their secrets. The tin sat there until I found it, powder bright as a lizard's back, and it burned a little where it touched my skin and left no mark anyone would need to call the doctor for. The doctor wrote that Honora had grown manic and then melancholic, and that a change of scenery would suit. They took her to the river and then to a place where the lawns were even and the clocks did not beat regardless of the house's temper. And a year later, Ambrose donated a sum to improve the ventilation in the women's ward at Danvers. Ruth arrived in the new century when men said that steam and paper had made progress inevitable, and she was a creature of that idea, a girl from Springfield with a father in the paper trade and a mother who wore her hair piled high with pins like a nest full of steel. She was practical in a way the Hartwells had not been, and she supervised the washing in a dress suited to an afternoon call if the bell rang, and she had very little patience for ghosts. The house liked her at first. The pump seemed to take her step and make the beat match, and the pipes did not hiss when she lit them, though she remarked once to the maid that the mantel in the dining room had begun to glow glass like a bruise when the valve was closed. She found a system in the cistern that impressed her, a ram that lifted water without complaint up to the attic tank, and she liked to stand over the device with her hand upon its body and feel its beat, as if to prove that a house's heart could be understood. She kept a book of remedies on the sideboard with recipes for nervous conditions that called for bromide and barley water, and often enough for rest in a room where men would not talk, and she dispensed advice in a tone that a shopkeeper would have admired. She conceived and brought forth a son in the summer of '08, who bellowed as if the world had offended him and then slept as if it had corrected itself. And in the weeks that followed, she discovered that sleep was a negotiation far above her. Pay and the beat of the house began to work at the place where a woman who has just brought a man into the world keeps her sanity. Ruth wrote to herself in pencil on the back of grocers' accounts when the night would not stop, and she noted each time the gas lights trembled without the hand upon them, and the way the papers left green at the cuffs of dresses worked in the parlor no matter how often the maid beat them in the yard. She made one error, which was to trust her husband with the raw meat of her fears, and he told the doctor that his wife had become sensitive to matters that did not trouble other ladies, and the doctor wrote in a hand so calm one could rest one's head upon it that Ruth must be kept in bed with the shades drawn and not allowed to read, nor to sew, nor to see her child until her nerves were taught their lessons. When Ruth's milk failed in the second week of such teaching, and she began to see men she did not know at the edges of the room where the lamp cast its weak ring, and when she insisted that the pump in the basement had altered its beat to spell words. They took her away from the child and then into the carriage. And afterward, Ambrose subscribed to a journal that argued with startling confidence that the womb wandered all over a body when a woman forgot her station. Lillian was last and brought with her the fashions that made Ruth uncomfortable, and by then the house had a reputation in the town that no polite neighbor would have dishonored by stating aloud. People lowered their voices when they said her name, because to say Hartwell wife had become to ask a question that men did not like to answer. She came in on the back of the Great War when the mill had found new life making uniform cloth that bled into the river like a weak tea, and she had been a nurse's aide in Worcester where the influenza year taught her to wash her hands more conscientiously than any lady had expected, and to divide her mind from her work when a body under the sheet wanted to be remembered. Lillian was not easily impressed, and she insisted on opening windows when the men complained of drafts, and she put out the gas lamps if she did not need them, and she bought a little electric fan that made a monk's hum on the dresser in the bedroom to ease the determination of the nights. She found in the attic a box of luminous paint someone had bought in a period when some men believed that radium was a tonic and a decoration both, and she painted a line on the edge of the nursery clock so that she could find the hour without lifting the mantel lamp to the face. I found that clock in the same room 30 years later with a pale mildew of green where her finger had pressed the brush and the brush had pressed the matter into time. Lillian wrote to a friend that the beat underfoot gave her a sense that the house was alive in a manner that was not altogether unfriendly, like a great animal that asked only to be stepped around with respect. The friend returned her letter with a paragraph cut from a magazine about houses built on springs and the sounds that such engineering would make. It did not last. The beat thickened and Lillian began to sense something else in the walls that she told no one about. She described it in a memorandum left in a book of recipes for preserves where a man would be bored away as a pressure that changed with the lamps and a taste like matches on the tongue when she sat too long in the parlor. When she conceived boldly and told the doctor to save his advice until she asked for it. And for 4 months, she proved that insolence is a tonic. And then she began to sleep in a way that helped no one. And the nurse's eyes darkened when she spoke to the cook, and the cook went to the market and said nothing and bought more onions than anyone could use. In the 7th month, a plumber came to look at the pump because the beat had grown irregular. And the plumber, a religious man, remarked that the ram had been set to a schedule that no new house would have tolerated. He shook his head and changed. Nothing. And that night the beat upset Lillian to a point where even Ambrose grew more quiet than he preferred to be. The journal that kept the house's business has a leaf with Lillian's name at the top and the word rest written in a doctor's hand. And 2 days later, there is a nurse's notation that Lillian had spoken of feeling as if the gas were whispering to her, which is the kind of phrase that men use to convict a woman of herself. The dissent was not theatrical, and that is the worst thing one can say about it. It made the day a little more tired, and the night a little more occupied, and the house a little more certain of its own righteousness. I walked the rooms with the boxes open upon chairs, and I put together facts in a way that had nothing to recommend it, but stubbornness and the memory of other rooms where paper had lied through its expensive teeth. In the pantry, I found a tin of sugar that had turned to clods and taken a blush of green, as if the grains had found romance with the walls and were ashamed but content. In the cellar, I found the lead lining of the cistern holed and repaired, and I found the ram pump working with a fidelity that makes a man nervous when he has learned to value his own errancies. The gas pipes in the walls bore a certain skill, bends that suggested the hand of a man who had spent time measuring, and a brass manifold in the basement called itself a control. In the small letters a machinist grinds with patience. And the manifold bore scratches that were not modern, and I learned with time that a man could dim one room from another if he had the map and the taste for it. In a drawer in Ambrose's study, I found the map, a trick of vellum and neat ink with lines that showed where gas was to be managed and where air would pass through the house so that voices could. There were notations on it in the same hand that had written checks to Danvers and to Butler and to a private little place in the hills where ladies were kept with the windows screened against their hopes, and the hand had written smile beside the parlor jets and rest above the blue room, and a note that in March the pump required attention and to call the man who did not notice things. Alongside the map lay a ledger richer in malice than money, wherein Ambrose recorded days when a wife had been calm and days when she had set his nerves to dance, and he assigned values to those days as if he had invented a currency that would redeem itself when the house took its cut. There are few sights uglier than a man's arithmetic applied to a woman's mind. I closed the book and elected not to add it to the Boston man's inventory, because sometimes history improves by a hair when a ledger meets flame. But even that tiny righteousness did not build a bridge across the larger creek. Under the stove, in the summer kitchen, I found a scatter of hairpins beaded with green, and by the door I found the stain one makes when one stands too long and neither opens the door nor turns away. It had been an old note in a Philadelphia paper that had taught me to think of green paper as a servant of mischief. A report from 20 years earlier about arsenic wallpaper making a bishop sick and a nursery fatal, and I went back to the Hartwell parlor with that paragraph in my head and a knife in my pocket to test a conjecture that would have consoled no one. The paper came away whole in strips where the room had been spared winter's worst, and in places it crumbled to a green flower that traveled instantly into the breath and then into the throat with a sting like broken peppermint. Below, the plaster was damp, as if the cistern's breath had made its way up a long brick as water will. Behind the paper, I found patches of flour that had grown in the smooth gloom, crystals catching the lantern, though the daylight still bothered. The windows and the crystals smelled of vinegar and a faint sweet that meant little by itself and everything when added to the whole. I remembered then the feel of the comb tooth drawing a green line, and I had the sense to go to the window and breathe the air that the mill had fouled in its way, but which then improved me all the same. In a closet behind the dining room, I discovered bottles in an old physician's case left from Silas's days, Fowler's solution among them, another old arsenic in a pretty suit, and I thought of nervous wives being given a little tonic for their nerves and a little note by their husbands, and a little time in a room where a pump taught a heart that the house had a better claim to beating. It is reasonable to find poison where a doctor's hand has been and to blame him. It is also reasonable to find that the man who paid the doctor had adjusted his own environment with the cool patience of a machinist who knows that constant pressure will bring whatever steel he is working to heal. I pulled more paper and felt the beat underfoot shopping at a faster market, and the lantern's flame leaning as if a breath had been drawn near it by a mouth that considered somewhere between benevolence and appetite, and I went to the basement to find the pump. The pump itself was beautiful in an ugly way, cast and filed and knocked together with a stubborn honesty that a machine of war might envy and a watch might whisper about in the dark. It took the world's downward passion for water and turned it back upon itself to lift that water again into a barrel above our heads. And in doing so, it beat a gentleman's beat against the stone that might as well have been the heart of the house given a metal language. It had been maintained. The grease was clean and firm, the bolts had not been allowed to rust to a sacrament, and the pipe had been lagged in wool and tar. Someone had made a liturgy of its care. Beside it lay a small, precise set of valves leading to the gas lines, and the manifold there bore the same scratches as the one above, little nicks that one might use in the dark when one loves control, and wishes to be sure which lever is which without trusting a candle. On a shelf there was a box with a lid that did not wish to come off until I told it a truth about knives. Inside lay a stack of papers that were not kinds, but records of days and nights, when certain combinations of pump and gas had been used, and the results noted with attention to the temper of the wife and the effect upon the silence of the house. There was a column headed P and another headed G and a third marked R, and the sums made a shape that a man with a furnace in his head would call a diagram. There were days when the beat had been allowed to grow strong and the lamps told to speak, and days when the lamps had been stifled and the beat allowed to do its own work alone. It would be too easy to say that the house alone drove them. They were ladies with minds from other lives and men's opinions in their ears, and doctors with gravity upon their breath and medicine with sweetness and poison in the same glass. And there were babies and the lack of babies and the war and the mills and the papers and the world changing its mind about women in a manner that made everyone misjudge the floor. The machine downstairs was not evil by itself, which is where the dread enters. These were choices, made in minutes with valves and impulses, made by a husband who had been taught by engineers that anything is solvable by patient pressure applied. Without squeamishness, and anything means a wife if a man is worse than he knows. I stood with my hand on the pump and felt the beat, and the beat told me nothing but itself, steady as a duty, and in that steadiness there was an insistence that explained something about Hartwells who had not known when to leave. The house. Asked them to be as it was, and they obeyed. In the attic I found the last, or perhaps the first clue a person might need, if one were the sort who understands wrists. A row of gloves pinned to the rafters, 5 pairs of kid turned smooth as language underneath, and within each a slip of paper folded with a name and a date. They had been set in mothballs and camphor, and the smell hit like a memory of funerals, conducted with precision. The names belonged to the wives and the dates to the evenings when a man had decided that his house required a new rhythm and his household required a new set of pins. Between 2 beams, where an old plasterer had once set a mortar board to rest and left it when it went to dust in the way of tools that get tired, a woman had scratched a small calendar with her hairpin, 5 bars with a 6th crossing, then a little sun like a child's, and then nothing. At the far gable, behind a trunk of winter clothes that had gone to powder, a window looked toward Danvers and farther toward the sea, and the glass was scratched by weather and by fingers in places, where a person might hide while a nurse went down the stair. The scratches made no words. They were lines in the same handful of shapes, the way a patient in a ward will make the same motion because it is the only motion permitted. And the shapes were circles with spokes that hinted at wheels, and I had already learned the harm that drawing a wheel can do to a person's sleep. Near the window, against a beam, there was a shallow shelf with 5 small objects that might as well have been offerings. A ribbon with a knot tied to keep a memory from slipping, a string of beads turned brown with skin, a scrap of paper with the corner chewed in a way that suggests hunger of other kinds, a cork from a vial with a crystal dried to it, a bit of baby's lace scorched at the edge by a too-close lamp. And looking at them did not teach me their owner's mind, but made it present anyway. The house creaked then with a new tone in its wood. Not a warning, but a confession. And I thought to leave the attic because the afternoon had turned the light into a sharp instrument. There is a temptation when faced with a story such as this to call it a haunting and be done. It is a proper conclusion for a parlor, and it gives the men in it something to resist in an appropriate posture. I have watched parishioners call a thing a ghost, when what they mean is that their hunger for explanation wishes to be fed by something that will not yield to any of their appetites, and I have been guilty enough of the same to sweep my own house for riddles when the answer was in the pantry making its own smell. The papers in Providence and Boston had printed a handful of careful lines when the first and the second wife went away, words like strain and confinement and hysteria lifted from a medical vocabulary that thought itself generous by naming a woman's suffering such that a gentleman could say it without blushing. There were small notices when Honora failed to attend a charity, and there was nothing at all of the kind printed when Ruth and Lillian were moved, because the world had grown busy with wars and new toys. Meanwhile, the pump beat and the gas moved with an accustomed will, and the blue room offered its cold comfort, and the parlor its green generosity. And if there were other factors, a child's sleep and hunger, a man's reading list, a physician's manner when he took up a pen and thought of money, they played the harmony rather than the melody. I walked from room to room, and everywhere I found a little consistency that explained how much can be accomplished by arrangement. The parlor was the place ladies were to spend afternoons, and the parlor was the place where the paper shed its powder and the gas mantles hung near the walls. The blue room was relieved but crossed by a hidden channel that carried the voice and the breath of a man at his desk. The pump did not fail because it was loved with an attention the wives could not command. In the kitchen, where the women might have taken refuge, the cistern decorated the breath of the place with a suggestion of lead, and the boiler glazed the air with headache if the draft was not right, and the back stairs were shut in against the weather in such a way that a person's lungs might complain without raising more than an eyebrow among those upstairs. It is true that a sudden madness took one of them after a child. It is plausible that another had a mind that ran to dark places even before she came. It is also true that a house may collaborate quietly in a man's will without any draft backward to the supernatural. I have seen ghosts. They have been ledger entries that put their hands upon a woman's shoulder and receipts placed in drawers, like weapons, and valves marked with scratches in the handwriting of a husband. The day I understood the manifold entirely, I felt a foolish courage take me, one that a smart man calls pride and a priest assigns to another authority. I made a sketch of what each valve likely did from the marks and the direction of the pipes, and I thought to set them all open, and sacraments reversed, so the house would have, for once, a light that it had not asked leave of a man to enjoy. It was a simple movement. Brass yields to a hand and to a reasonable wrench, and an honest valve turns as obediently as any child who has not learned yet how to lie. I set the gas lines to their harmless, and went upstairs to see if the parlor would behave like a room without opinions. The beat underfoot did not change, of course, because water loves its own rhythm, and the green paper made no noise. But the air had a new plainness, as if a pane had been lifted from a specimen, and the creature within it had decided to breathe. I pulled another length of paper and coughed and thought of foolish gentlemen in the magazines who had called other men's wives delicate in the face of poison, and I went to the window to cleanse myself on the winds of the mill. In the stair accident changed its mind and came early. My hand slipped on the banister where the green had beaded, and I fell one riser and then another. Not far enough to make a poem, but far enough to strike the base of my spine against a riser in a way that made me say my mother's name without, owning the thing in words. The beat continued, and lying there I understood why a woman of good sense might say that the beat was a companion, because in the flat pain after an accident, anything repeated without malice is a solace, and I was briefly ashamed of having judged from the safety of other rooms. I rose slowly and went into the basement to sit with the pump as an apology, and it did not accept the apology because it is a machine, and that is the sort of behavior that explains mechanical righteousness better than any treatise. I touched the manifold again and reconsidered the scratches and thought of other hands and other times when men had stood there with a plan and a pulse and a household above them, and I went upstairs with my own plan altered and my pulse reduced to a more reasonable hope. The ending of the Hartwell story is known in outline. There are 5 graves bearing titles that people stopped reading before the names, in a quarter of Sleepy Hollow under a maple that drops everything in a hurry when the season insists. Margaret lies there with a line about her patience that must have pleased her husband more than it pleased anyone who listened to the old woman's recollection of her letters. Eliza lies under a phrase about her taste. Honora lies under a phrase about duty to a family not her own. Ruth lies under a mercy a minister must have chosen for his own relief. Lillian lies under a verse that makes a rhyme with light and night and has nothing to recommend it. Their husbands lie under heavier stones with a hand in the carving for the mills and the war and the town's business. The pump, of course, lies nowhere, which is one of the little threats that keep men honest. There remains in the Danvers files a memorandum clipped to the back of an intake form by a woman whose initials mark other acts of conscience, that the patient complained of the sensation of whispers in the breath, and that her lips bore a stain. Not wholly consistent with rouge. It is a small thing, a note kept in a place where dust loves paper and time loves dust. In the Boston firm's ledger, there is a separate accounting for the disposal of household goods that cannot be sold in good conscience, and there is an inventory of green paper removed to rubbish, and a price paid to a man who was instructed to keep his own counsel and his own handkerchief close while he dragged the sheets down. I was asked if I had found any manuscripts or diaries. I told them I had found the usual accounts and some recipes. I did not speak of the map, or of the ledger that weighed a wife in units of order and peace, because the latter had already disappeared into my stove, and the former lay under a board in my trunk, where it continues to teach me that a house's ethics can be drawn in pencil. Some things I left are not mine to move, and I did not cover them with language all the same. The pump still beat when the last of the paper came down, and the paint was dry and the windows were opened for a week in a row. a fit of optimism. The beat slowed when the cistern drained after the workmen loosened a plug that had been set tight since the century began, and the sound changed from a comfortable thump to a wounded click, and then to a kind of sigh such as a bellows makes. When a smith lays down his hammer and nods at the boy to bank the coals. I attended to that as if it were a funeral and stood at the top of the basement stairs and listened for the last of it. And when it came, I imagined the house would grow still and be another, like any object that has been scrupled into quiet. This is not how such things finish. The lights that had been electrified in half a dozen rooms, as a concession to a world that no longer tolerated gas, behaved as lights do and made their faint hum. The wind off the river entered by 3 windows at once, and each used its own voice. And from somewhere, perhaps the pipes that had once taken the gas and now carried nothing but the house's memory of being a creature, there came a tick that kept the old pace with a humor that made my spine shiver in a way that a sensible man would attribute to tiredness and poor diet. I closed the valve at the manifold, and I loosened the leather on the pump, and I put a board across the cistern at the kitchen to ease my mind. The tick did not lose heart. Years have passed, and I walk past the Hartwell front most Saturdays to fetch my paper, and I hear in the gravel, or the memory of gravel, a small insistence. And sometimes in the winter, when the mill's steam rides the cold like a carriage in a parade, I catch a smell under it of sugar and medicine and old hairpins. And I go home and do my sums, as if the ledger will forgive me. There is a story that a woman, not of the family and not then young, went to the house years later when it had been let to students of the college to see the rooms where her sister had been young and ambitious and then less so. She stood in the parlor and drew in her breath and said a word that is not a prayer, and she went to the blue room and put her hand on the wall at a height where a woman's head goes when she has been taught to lie down. And she said something softer that was not to any god one can find by walking to church. The students were kind and had not learned yet the reflex to mock, and they lifted the carpet and found the marks to show her where the bed had sat, and they looked for the scratches on the plaster where someone had written the days in chalk, and then rubbed them out, and they listened to the pipes, and because they were young they heard a beat that they told themselves was pipes. The woman took 2 steps to the window and pressed her hand to the pane and left it there until the mist made her hand a pale continent. When she took it away, the shape lingered and then returned to glass as all small miracles do, and she left. And no one asked her name. I do not know whether mercy follows malice through rooms and gives back what can be given. I do know that the rooms remember and the hands remember, and that a house built to instruct its inhabitants will go on instructing long after the class deserves a different teacher. I keep the map of the manifold by my bed, and sometimes in the night, I trace a line with my finger and feel my pulse answer to the line, and I have learned enough at last to lift my hand away and allow the dark to educate my heart on its own terms. I have come to love that stubborn green point that adheres to old paper and then to a person's breath as if it would like to be in a body. I suppose this is a confession and not a defense, but I offer it as a man who has learned that poison and devotion often share a room, and make of it a temple without any god. When snow comes, the old house loses none of its tricks, and gains a new noise when wind finds the holes under the cornice that a good carpenter would recognize as the end of honesty. The pipes tick then in a pretty way, and the beat, which I insist does not exist, carries up from the basement in a manner that fills a man's chest with an old memory of fear. I think of the wives and of the men who learned their way around, valves and phrases, and of the doctors who thought themselves brave because they could keep words clean while the rooms dirtied the women in them, and of a town that loved a beat, that oil and water made together and did not learn to hate it in time. I have a wife who sleeps with her mouth slightly open and leaves a soft string of sound that breaks and begins again in a way that would soothe any child. We use lamps that do not hiss and paper that does not shed and a stove that makes its own weather, and sometimes in the night I wake and the dark is not quiet and my mouth tastes of sugar gone sour, and I put my hand out on the bed until I find the silk of her nightgown, and I remind myself that this century has its own poisons and its own engineers, but that I can go downstairs and lift a switch and fill the kitchen with a different kind of light. I do not go to the Hartwell house when I can help it. Sometimes the Boston men call, and I go and I take a quiet inventory of who has removed what in the slow light way that families fade when their means become the history other families want to buy. The green is nearly all stripped now, and the valves are closed and soldered, and the pump is a quiet sculpture that a student has persuaded a professor to preserve in the manner of men who want to be men of science and not of machines. And the cistern has been filled with clean sand. The beat remains. It is one of the lessons the place leaves suspended in the air for those who stay a moment too long and breathe as a person must. And the lesson is irreconcilable and polite, as New England itself is polite when it asks you to dine with your own conscience and name your portion. It is not a consolation to end without fire or absolution. But this is not an age that gives much credit to epics, and perhaps that is grace in its thin coat. I picture the 5 pairs of gloves turning themselves on their pins as winter moves the rafters, a small creak in a sky invisible to those in the rooms below. And I picture the ladies nicking their fingers on the comb teeth and not blaming the comb, because it is in a lady's nature to blame herself first and then the weather. I picture Ambrose in his heaven, if there be one adequate to receive such men and improve them, trying the valves in a cloud loft and coming away confused because the instrument will not be told what to do by a man with a good memory for scratch marks. I picture the doctor learning to rest at last, and perhaps meeting a woman who does not forgive him and does not ask him to confess. There is a last image that will not leave me, and I offer it without any argument. The parlor in a winter afternoon, with the light on the carpet and the air too still, and a little green dust curdling where the sun has come to be kind. And in that dust, the faint track of 5 fingers, as if someone who once loved the room put her hand to the rug to rise, and then did not. The track holds a while, and then the air takes it, and the beat under the floor returns to indifferent work, and the house waits for evening, and the street outside receives a modest procession of lives that will not know it is passing a place, that ate its own hope in careful spoonfuls and kept a napkin on its lap while doing so. The map stays folded in my trunk, and occasionally I take it out and trace the gas lines and think of arteries and advantages, and I put it away again and try to go one more day without loving a machine for its predictability when the people about me are trying very hard to be surprising. I do not ask the house for mercy. I expect it will give me a lesson if I ask, and it will be the same lesson it gave its own. I do not have time for that. I am very tired and hesitant to hear my own heart in a thing that was meant to pump water. And yet on winter nights, it seems a reasonable ambition to aspire to a simpler beat, even if it is a borrowed one.